Desperate times call for desperate measures. So is the theme of the Great Depression and World War II. In this documentary, the Great Depression and World War II will be discussed in depth with this theme in mind. Let us begin. There were a couple major causes of the Great Depression. Most prominent of these was unequal distribution of wealth, the decrease in demand for goods, the overproduction, and the tariffs countries put on incoming goods. The straw that broke the camel's back, however, was the stock market crash of 1929 in America. The U.S. populace was so psychologically affected by this event that they soon became panicked, which just made things worse. With the U.S. economy gone, the rest of the world fell financially with them. And so the global Great Depression began. The Great Depression affected us greatly economically, socially, and psychologically. Economically, due to the Depression, most businesses were in a tight spot. There were no jobs to be found, trade went down to an all-time low, and living standards were lowered as well. Socially, almost everyone had very little money and was out of a job as a result of the Depression, making poverty a big issue to contend with. Also, the living standards were poor considering the amount of money people had, meaning many a community was formed in poor hovel districts. Psychologically, people no longer had trust in the banks due to the Depression and were panicked, scared, anxious, and depressed about the conditions they were living through in respect to the future. Different countries responded to the crisis in different ways, however. America's response to the global depression was to raise tariffs in hopes of rebuilding banks. We also removed loan investments from Europe and tried to restore confidence in the system through economic programs while trying to help the people via social programs. England's response was to increase tariffs as well, to increase taxes, and to regulate currency in hopes of stopping inflation. France's response was to increase worker benefits, but unemployment still stayed high and the economy still stayed low. Germany's response was to simply print more money, which led to inflation. Their economy failed the worst because of this. Japan's response was to become socialist, in which they built recovery programs to create equal distribution of wealth and also to expand, thereby gaining more wealth. The U.S.'s plan to deal with the Great Depression was FDR's New Deal, which created economic and social programs to combat the Depression and help the people. Some of these programs did such things as regulate the banks and the stock market, offer public work projects, create relief programs, create administrations, authorities, and commissions like the Works Progress Administration, and invest in businesses and industries. In all accounts, these programs were met with success, but they did not end the Depression. They just lightened its burden on the people. During FDR's presidency, he mainly focused on creating programs set on improving life for the average American. Programs included the WPA and the AAA, both of which improved the job industry. Another thing that was significant in FDR's political career was that he was reported to have constant conflict with the federal legislative branch, who he thought was limiting his power. That's why, during the course of his presidency, he expanded the powers of the executive branch so as to outdo that of the other branches. In addition, as president, he did not take a laissez-faire style to economics as his predecessors had done, but instead molded it and shaped it as he wanted so as to help improve the economy. Soon to come was World War II, however, which would kill the Great Depression. In fact, it would occur due to the Treaty of Versailles. The treaty forced the Axis powers to make reparations to the Allies, economically killing these nations. When the Great Depression hit, the former Axis powers were who got hit the hardest, along with the Allied powers that did not get anything from the treaty. The state of these nations fueled anger in their populaces. This anger was responsible for putting in charge fascist regimes in nations like Germany and Italy, whose populaces were angry at how the old government was doing things and wanted hard, firm leadership. Anger to spur them on and revenge on those who did this to them. You could say desperate times forced them to take desperate measures. The fascist dogma became conquer, grow, and be supreme. They believed they were the best, so they could and should take over others. This supranationalism caused countries like Japan to invade China, and eventually Germany to invade its neighbors and Italy to invade North Africa, seeing as there was no repercussions to Japan's action. In fact, the fascist nations improved their economies by going into a totally controlled economic state, oftentimes associated with war. Through the conquering of their neighbors, as was the goal of these fascist countries, powers like Italy and Germany became world powers again, leading the world in economic wealth and militaristic might, along with Japan. Weary of more conflict and thinking of their money woes, the former Allied powers decided to appease the fascist nations by letting them invade and conquer smaller nations. This appeasement just fueled these nations' resolve, however, forcing the Allies eventually to intervene and declare war when, in particularly, Germany expanded too far without permission. Coming to their comrades' side, the other fascists teamed up against the former Allies, and so began World War II. World War II saw advancements in air technology, making air raids a major part of battles now. A strategy known as blitzkrieg also became popular. This was critical, seeing as the war ended due to this new technology and strategy. At the beginning of the war, Germany pushed west of its border, conquering all things to France. Struggling to conquer England, Germany eventually gave up that front, beginning to push into Russia. Germany could not recapture all of Russia due to the Russian no resource left behind tactics and cold winters. The German unsuccessful offensive at Stalingrad marked their last major push in the east, which weakened their army to a point of no return, basically destroying their eastern front. By this time, Japan began taking territory in the Pacific and Alaska, having bombed the U.S. base at Pearl Harbor, declaring war on the U.S., thereby dragging us into the war and officially out of isolation. You see, before this occurred, Britain asked America to become an ally, and America formed the Land Lease Program, which supported the war effort by leasing weapons and military assets to the Allies, thereby passively being an active ally. After Pearl Harbor, though, the U.S. entered the war for real, sending troops of their own into the heart of the fight. The U.S. drove Japan back for having had better tech like radar and having figured out their codes. Decimating the Japanese fleet at the Battle of Midway, the U.S. Navy turned the course of the Pacific Front for the better. Shortly afterwards, England, the US, and most all remaining Allied powers combined forces to invade Normandy on what was called D-Day, so as to push into Europe so as to retake it. Though slow, tenuous work, the Allies succeeded with only one last offensive push by the Germans, being their failed Battle of the Bulge, an attempt to cut off and destroy a portion of the Allied army so as to keep Europe. With the Allies marching towards Berlin from the west and the Russians coming towards Berlin from the east, the German resolve broke. Now with Japan as the only real threat left, America used the atomic bomb on the Japanese cities Hiroshima and Nagasaki after recapturing Pacific islands that had been taken by the Japanese and taking some of the Japanese islands themselves, causing the Japanese to quickly surrender. The US used their new weaponry on Japan to bring the violence to an end, as well as to avoid fighting Japan's big cities, which would have created even more fatalities than were seen in the destruction of the two towns. I guess you would say that they were just trying to navigate desperate times by using desperate and extreme measures. During the war, things dramatically changed in the US. World War II being a total war, all aspects of life centered around it, had the economy back on track in no time, with plenty of jobs to go around. In fact, there were so many jobs to go around, women began to enter the workforce because there were more jobs than white male people. So during the war, women, socially and culturally, were changing from housewives to workers. In fact, 6 million women were employed during the war, along with minorities, while the American men were out of town. But when the war was won and the men returned, the women lost their jobs and became domesticated housewives once again. All work done at home in the U.S. during the war was used towards defense. The Allies needed the U.S. to provide food, supplies, and war materials, which also meant valuable resources like cloth, metal, and food were rationed at home so the rest could be used towards the war. Men were also a valuable resource, though, both at home and at war. This is why able young men were pulled into the army by propaganda or by draft. Propaganda also played a big role in the war, encouraging women, children, and all those left in America to work hard by helping the war effort at home via war bonds, metal drives, and the like. Even blacks became a part of the U.S. Army via propaganda and or the draft. Though they were treated badly at first, African Americans were soon treated better due to the U.S.'s need for more men in the army. At home, however, blacks fared even worse. They were unable to get jobs, were discriminated against across the country, not just in the South, and were segregated from the whites, and were even being lynched. Japanese Americans fared even worse, though. Forced to give up their jobs, houses, and most of their money and belongings by a bill created by FDR, the Japanese Americans were forced to live in ghettos with horrible living conditions. What's more, the Supreme Court upheld the ghetto bill, determining it as being constitutional. Blaming them for the attack on Pearl Harbor and suspecting them as being spies or traitors to their country, we totally discriminated against Japanese Americans during World War II. The last minority that was affected in America during the war were the Mexicans. Brought into the U.S. to work for us temporarily, the Mexicans were heavily discriminated against. Mexicans were barred from American institutions as well as beat down by American citizens and the U.S. authorities. This was because they were stereotyped as gang members with their flamboyant zoot suits that were just ethnic, colorful clothing. These suits, however, were associated with gang violence. Finally, we have come to the section of this documentary devoted to the short and long-term effects of World War II. For Germany, the war was not only about expanding and growing more powerful, but also it was Germany's means to accomplish its final solution policy, which was basically creating the perfect race by weeding out those humans who were deemed less than perfect. Jews especially were a target during the German genocide, now known as the Holocaust, due to their being illegitimately blamed for Germany's bad economy. After the war, the United Nations, which was like the League of Nations but has more authority, and the Geneva Conventions were established to guarantee such crimes against humanity as seen in the Holocaust and World War II would never be enacted again. Also, after the Holocaust, Jews felt weakened and exposed due to their fates near extermination at the hands of Nazi Germany. Fearing that such a calamity might occur again, Jews all over the world of the highest rank came together to discuss plans in creating a Jewish state so that there was a country that could protect their faith. After a lot of discussing and input from the UN, it was decided that a new country where Palestine was would be formed as a Jewish state for Jews all over the world. Today we know the country as the Jewish state of Israel, and from its creation came much strife from the Arabs that inhabited the area beforehand. Even today, conflict between Jews and Arabs continues, all of which stems from the creation of Israel by the destruction of the Arabs' Palestine. Modern day jihad. Terrorism, in fact, has stemmed from the creation of Israel. Finally, the last substantial effect of World War II was the Cold War, which was a standoff between the US and the USSR, the only two remaining powerful countries after World War II, who ironically had radically different schools of thought, with each hating the other. This hate bred fear, considering each side didn't want more countries to follow the other's school of thought. Therefore, competition ensued in converting countries and regions to each nation's respective political system. The US and the USSR, though, also competed with each other on other fronts, like during the space race, where each tried to get to the moon first. This cold competition between countries would eventually cease after 40 years, but right after the war it caused major tension in the world's political climate, especially when it came to Russia's wanting to expand its borders and influence, thereby threatening the US with more communist rivals in the world. And there you have it, the history of the Great Depression and World War II in a nutshell. Really, these events were just desperate people taking desperate measures to ensure the best potential outcome of their situation. And in this light, these events do not seem horrible so much as they look pitiful or despondent. It seems, as demonstrated by history, desperate times leave people wanting for security and solace, which can be found in extreme measures and beliefs. When Germany was economically dead, people saw hope in radical ideas and actions since they promised radical change, and in extension, hope of better conditions. Therefore, it might be surmised disparate times lead to extreme ideas and actions due to their potential impact for the better when all else seems fallible, with no other actions merited with promise.